Hi, I'm Tula Pink, and this is my quilt exhibit at AQS QuiltWeek in Paducah called Tula in Stitches. So this quilt is called Center Stage, and this is my interpretation. This is basically a Tula Pink version of a Civil War quilt. It's based on a quilt I saw in a museum that was actually a Civil War reproduction quilt, and so I kept a lot of the structure the same and just changed the colors. I really consider myself a traditional quilter. A lot of my quilts, if you photograph them in black and white, actually look quite traditional. It's really just the color that makes them different or makes them non-traditional, if you will, but I very much consider myself a traditional quilter. The structure of my quilts is usually very based on quilt history, Americana quilt history. And so this was just my version or interpretation of a Civil War quilt I saw at a museum, just with all the colors turned up to 11. So this is probably one of my favorite quilts that I've made. I was going through a pretty intense Pirates of the Caribbean phase at the time, back when Johnny Depp was still hot. And so I made this pirate quilt, and it's all skulls, pirate skulls, minus citrus colors, so I called it scurvy because that's how you get scurvy, from a lack of citrus. And then I have the very hardcore chain link on the sides just to keep my, edgy street cred as a quilter. You got to make them dark sometimes. But this is one of my favorite quilts because it's a really simplified interpretation of a skull, which I think is kind of hilarious in conjunction with quilting, which is considered such a sweet, traditional, folky art form. Than to do something sort of dark and unexpected in quilting, I think is always a really fun sort of juxtaposition of ideas. And so this is one of my favorite quilts, and I've shown this quilt many times over the years, and it was only very recently that someone pointed out to me that there's actually a skull in the very bottom corner whose jaw is up on upside down. And I've literally looked at this quilt 1,000 times and never ever noticed that one's jaw was upside down. So he's sort of the jowly mean one, I've decided. But yeah, so, and instead of being upset by that, that's actually one of my favorite parts of the quilt, because things happen. They're things that are made by humans in a room by ourselves. So sometimes mistakes happen and we don't see them until it's far too late. And those always become my favorite parts of the quilts. So this is the butterfly quilt. It's called the butterfly quilt because I didn't want any competition from any butterfly quilt ever for the history of quilting. So anytime anybody refers to, that quilt, the butterfly quilt, Google will always find this pattern. But this is actually made from the leftover blocks from a book I wrote called Tula Pink City Sampler, 100 Modern Quilt Blocks. And while I was trying to conceive of how the book would function, what size the blocks would be, I made a whole bunch of extra blocks. And they were all up on my design wall in my studio. And kind of like when you look at the clouds and they're making shapes and you're like, oh, look, it's a teddy bear holding a pineapple or whatever you see in the clouds. I sort of saw the wing of a butterfly, and I thought, if I just move these around just a little bit, I can actually make it a butterfly. So this is a quilt entirely made out of tossed out blocks that didn't make it into the book, rearranged into this form. And one of my favorites to date, because I love a quilt that's a giant illustration, because it's a lot like how I design fabric as a big illustration. So sometimes I like quilts that are really a traditional block structure, and sometimes I like to make just one giant image out of fabric. It's sort of like painting with prints and patterns. So those were some of my quilts from my quilt exhibit here at AQS QuiltWeek. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you at the next one.